Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first lecture in our Baroque for Breakfast series. And I'll just share my screen now and we can get started. So I've called this presentation The Forgotten Women of Baroque Music. And I've used the word forgotten because these women were highly regarded in their time as great musicians and composers, but we don't really know about them too much today. Um, Even if you're a Baroque music fan, you may not have heard of these women. I just checked a list of Baroque composers on Wikipedia, for example, and out of 50 composers, there is only one woman listed on that list, and one of these four. The women we're going to talk about, their pictures are here from left to right. We've got Francesca Caccini here, Barbara Strozzi here, Isabella Leonarda, and Elisabeth Jacquet de la Guerre. Now I've selected these four women because they represent the areas that women composers existed in, the court, at home, in the convents. And then Elisabeth Jacquet de Guerre is I've added her at the end because she's a little bit later than the other three, and she started out in the court, but she's our best example of a more independent, I would say, freelance musician. So let's start with some brief background of what was going on before the Baroque period. We had sacred music in the convents, secular music by the troubarets, that's female troubadours in France. We had minstrels and amateur musicians. And you can see here, you've probably heard of Hildegard of Bingen. Here's a picture of her transcribing some music to her scribe. She says, "A musical performance softens hard hearts, leads in the humor of reconciliation, and summons the Holy Spirit." And this other icon is La Contessa del Dia. And she was a troubadour, and she says, "I must sing about it whether I want to or not." So there was certainly music being written and being sung by women back in the medieval period. And this next slide is just some engravings and drawings that we've seen in the literature. So there's a jongleress there with handbells from a 10th century manuscript. In the middle, you've got a woman playing the harp, Sappho. And on the right, there's an example of some music happening at the court of Duke René II of Lorraine. There's a woman playing a dulcimer on her lap there, and the woman in the middle is playing the shawm, and another one playing a portative organ. So we know that women were making music back in that time. Let's jump to the Renaissance period. We continue to have the nuns making music, and noble women were expected to be able to sing and perhaps play an instrument, but not in public. And they were only allowed to play instruments that were befitting of a lady. For example, harpsichord, lute, harp. But they weren't allowed to play wind instruments or violin. They're expected to cultivate feminine instruments that would not require them to alterate their facial expressions or physical demeanor. Like they couldn't be playing a wind instrument and have their cheeks puffed out, or playing a violin and having these awkward hand positions and neck positions. It also began to be acceptable for women born into professional musical families to perform music, particularly in the courts. But still, the women were excluded from formal music education in conservatories, from participating in church services, and from any kind of master apprenticeship system where they could learn their musical craft. And in the Renaissance, the exclusion from formal music education was quite important because at that time, the style was very complicated, polyphony, and they would have certainly had to have a formal education to learn the theory behind that, and they were just not able to do that. Um, and underneath all this, I have a quote here by Elisabeth Wood. There was a persistent underlying view of patronage, tokenism, trivialization that pronounced women fragile, that domesticated women's work, and that kept women out of professions, out of prestige and power. So I'm not going to dwell on that aspect, but just keep it in your mind that there was a lot of stuff going on that they had to deal with at the time. So at the end of the 16th century, there were a lot of things happening musically that favored the women composers, because the women composers were primarily writing solo songs for women's voices and accompanied by usually a single instrument, like I said, a harp or a harpsichord or a lute, something like that. But at the end of the 16th century, new genres began to appear, such as opera, the solo and concerted madrigal, cantata, sonata, and new ways of writing, new idioms. Rather than this complicated polyphony, they went back to monody and homophony, where you've got a single melody accompanied by a bass line, and then in homophony you've got the middle voices filled out. And so there's this treble bass polarity, which really fit well with the type of songs these women were singing and writing. And there was a greater focus on the solo voice or instrument and virtuosic idiomatic playing. And because of the birth of opera, there was a rise in virtuoso singers, and the Italian court started to seek out and train young women singers specifically to perform in the opera. There was also more interest in amateur music, and to go along with that, a requirement for music lessons, which gave some of these women a place to work. So the first person I'm going to talk about is Francesca Caccini, and there's a couple of photos here. The one on the etching up in the top left is really the only photo that we have of her that we know is her. The painting in the bottom left, lute player, is thought to be of her because it was painted by the father of Francesca's best friend. And you see someone there playing a lute. She's got a lute, and she's got a violin, her violin-like instrument, and a couple of different manuscripts, which certainly suggests that it might be her. So Francesca was born in Florence to a famous musical family, and she grew up at the Medici court in Florence. Her father was Giulio Caccini, and he was involved in the very early operas, and so she was around that whole field of composing and the operas when she was a child in the Medici court. And her father created a singing group of Francesca, her mother, her sister, and her brother, and he used to take them around to different courts, and kind of like the Jackson 5 or something like that, and they would sing. And Francesca was always the favorite. It became obvious that she was the best one of the group, and she became quite famous doing that. So she received a musical education from her father, and she became a virtuoso singer, lute, guitar, and harpsichord player. She worked at the Medici court throughout her career, and when she was 20 years old, she was officially hired as a court musician. At that time, the court was being run by two women, Christine of Lorraine and the Archduchess Maria Maddalena. At this time, the Cosimo had died, and his son was to take over, but the son wasn't old enough. So these two women were acting as regents, and they hired Francesca to be their main court musician and composer, probably because she was a woman, and her musical virtuosity sort of exemplified an idea of female excellence that they wanted to portray. There was always this sort of competition going on between the choruses, particularly with the music, and they thought basically that it would make them look good if they had a female composer, which it did. So she wrote the first opera composed by a woman, and maybe the first Italian opera to be performed outside of Italy. They performed her opera for a visit from a count from Poland, and he really liked it, and then they performed it in Warsaw. And she composed 17 of these sort of theatrical works that she didn't call them operas; she called them ballettos. But if you look at these works, they had all the components of what we would consider an opera. And there's some thought that she specifically called them ballettos so as to not sort of try to overstep her famous father, who was writing operas at the time. And she being just a lowly woman could not compose something like her father. So they weren't really ballettos. There was no ballet, no dancing as such in these works. And her excellence was highly recognized by the contemporaries at the time. So I'll go through a couple of pieces by Francesca just so you can get an idea. The first piece is from Il Primo Libro delle Musiche, and this is a collection of 36 solo songs and soprano bass duets. And note the dedication here. All musicians always put a dedication at this time to kind of suck up to their patrons, but she did that consistently and dedicated everything to the Medici family. So this song is in the early sort of monody style with one solo voice and accompaniment, and I'll just play some of that now. And if you listen to the music and the words, she was very particular as to where the syllables of the words were placed in coherence with the harmonic development. So she adds some vocal melismas to the melody just to make sure that everything lines up with the harmony, and you can really hear the harmony changing right in line with the words. So quite a beautiful melody and just a simple accompaniment, and this was quite common of her style. So the next piece by Francesca I'll talk about is the only surviving manuscript of the opera, La Liberazione di Ruggiero. And you could say, one might say, that this is a feminist opera because it explores the theme of women in power. And it was commissioned by the two Medici women who were in charge of the court at the time. And it's very unusual for women to compose large-scale works with the entire orchestra, so this is quite significant that she did this. The opera is a story of two powerful women in leadership, two sorceresses, a good sorceress and a bad sorceress, and they kidnap poor old Ruggiero, or the bad one does, and takes him to an island, and then the good sorceress eventually saves him and takes him back to his wife. And so the female characters are really strong and powerful in this opera, and they're very complex, and the whole theme of gender is woven into the music. For example, she associates flat keys with the female characters, sharp keys with the male characters, and the androgynous sorceress is portrayed in the key of C major. And there's a scene here, a little etching from, this was a huge spectacle with, elaborate staging. And there's a scene here from the original 1625 production. And it was very complex and elaborate. The sorceresses would arrive on dolphins, and they were singing plants, and enormous boats made out of whalebone, and that grew wings and flew away, and a chorus of monsters, and the final scene has a ballet designed to be performed on horseback, which they had going on outside, and all the audience would look out the windows to see it. So it was a huge spectacle. So I'm just going to play a bit of the prologue, and you can hear all of the instrumentation. There's some great trumpet action here, which is why I like this one. We'll play some of the prologue from the opera. Play a bit from one of the arias, the aria of the shepherd. There's a lot of beautiful music to choose from in this opera, but I'll just play a little bit of this aria.
Ardeva amore
that's a little bit from Francesca Caccini's opera. The next woman we're going to talk about is Barbara Strozzi. And she was born into an important Florentine family. Her father was a lawyer, a poet, and a playwright, but most importantly, he was one of the first libretti to write the early operas. He wrote libretti for Monteverdi and others at the beginning of the Baroque period. She studied with composer Francesco Cavalli. Her father arranged for that to happen. And it appears that people that have reviewed the literature think that her father, Giulio Strozzi, had quite a progressive view of women and their societal role. So he really made an effort to get her educated in music and found opportunities for her to perform. She became a virtuoso singer, and she didn't perform outside the house. She performed at intimate, private gatherings in her father's home. And her father formed a group called the Academy of the Like-Minded, and this was all men, and they would meet at his house and they would discuss, art and politics and all of these issues. And he introduced her to these people, and she would perform music at these meetings, and all of these men at this academy would eventually become her patrons, and you can see in the manuscripts that she dedicates one after the other to all these different people. She didn't have a single patron like a prince or something like that, but she just dedicated to all of these different men in the academy. And she was the most extensively published composer of her time. She composed 8 collections of vocal music and over 100 madrigals, arias, cantatas, and motets. And she was recognized as one of the earliest composers, male or female, to write cantatas in such high numbers. And there's a lot of controversy in the literature about this portrait of her. Everyone seems to think it is definitely a portrait of her. It was by an artist with the name Strozzi, but it's not thought that he was related. Her father commissioned a portrait of himself and this portrait of Barbara, and so there's a lot of discussion about why she has this sort of wardrobe malfunction. There were a lot of rumors at the time that she may have been a courtesan, and it didn't help that she was meeting with all these men in her father's house all the time. And she actually did have 3 children by one of the men in the academy, but she was very busy raising her family, and I think that she probably was too busy doing that and writing music to do much else. And so we will never know why she is dressed this way in this portrait. Some think that she's just a representation of the muse of music. Maybe that's what it is. Okay, well, let's look at a couple of pieces by Barbara Strozzi. This first madrigal we're going to look at, Silentio Nocivo, Harmful Silence. This one was written, this is Opus 1, and it was the first book of madrigals that she wrote. She was 25 years old when she wrote this. And if you look at the dedication, I must reverently consecrate this first work, which as a woman I publish all too boldly. So she's, really being humble about, I'm a woman, I shouldn't be doing this type of thing. But a lot of her dedications were worded in this way. So this one is you could call it a concerted madrigal. It's a madrigal with instrumental accompaniment, It's SATB with basso continuo. And just listen to the way she's using the music to support the words. And there's a change of mood when she talks about express oh my heart, and when she's talking about sweetness, is very sweet chordal structure there. In when she says afflicted mouth, there's this big long descending line. So she's very much in favor of this seconda pratica, which you'll hear about a lot when Marco does his lecture next week. So that's Harmful Silence, one of the first madrigals that Barbara Strozzi wrote. The second piece I'd like to look at is from her Opus 2, and this is a different kind of a style, although it's still just a melody with instrumental accompaniment. And this one is called Amor Dormiglione, and it's roughly translated as Sleepyhead Cupid. And the lyrics sort of urge Cupid to stop sleeping so he can shoot his arrows of love. And I picked this one because the singer in this piece is Susie LeBlanc, who is our new artistic director at Early Music Vancouver. I'll just play a little bit of this for you. look at one more piece here. This piece is called L'Agrimé, and this is a solo cantata. It's a lament, and again, there's a highly refined use of seconda pratica. The rhetorical device is here to capture the moods and the images of the text. For example, you can see this big, long descending line right at the beginning. It takes her a whole octave to say, "My tears." And why do you hold back? She said, "Why do you hold back?" And then she holds back with a rest. You can hear it very succinctly there. And you can hear the change of character when she's talking about let burst forth the fierce pain down here. So I'll just play some of this for you. Now I'm going to go on to the next composer, and this is Isabella Leonarda. And there's a portrait there of Isabella. This is from the Leonarda family tree. That portrait is in a museum in Europe. So Isabella was born into a noble family, and she went to live in a convent at the age of 16. And it's thought that she may have studied with the composer Gasparo Casati at the Novara Cathedral. And her family was fairly rich and was a benefactor of the convent. She became the mother superior in that convent, and she held very important roles. And she was also the music teacher there. She was a highly regarded composer in her home city, but not so well known elsewhere. She wrote about 200 compositions in nearly every sacred genre. And she wrote 12 sonatas, which were the first instrumental pieces written by a woman. And she played around with Corelli's sonata form. As you know, Corelli created the original sonata form with 4 movements, slow, fast, and she didn't follow that at all. Many of her pieces had many more movements than that, and certainly not in that order. I'm going to play a couple of pieces by Isabella here. The first one is a motet for 4 voices, and I picked this one because it's kind of an example of how, even though she was in a convent, she was certainly aware of the contemporary techniques that were being used by composers at that time. And in this piece, it's quite lively because it's a celebration of the Virgin Mary, It's a upbeat piece, and it's in like a 6/8 dance tempo, and to express kind of the joyous character of the text. And you can see how she uses like tutti passages and solo passages to get the contrast, a dynamic contrast, and create an echo effect. And she's using imitation and very expressive use of melisma in places where she's saying "Pray for us." So I'll just play some of this motet. So that's a motet by Isabella Leonarda. And this one's all of these four voice motets that she wrote for soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. It's quite interesting because they were published and they were meant for men, choirs of men and boys to be singing in churches. And there is some description in some of her notes that they were singing these in the convent as well. And for the bass part, they either raised an octave so the women could sing it, or there's also some mention of some of the nuns playing trombones and playing the bass part on trombones, which I thought was pretty cool because they weren't supposed to be playing wind instruments at all, and there's nuns in this convent playing trombones. I like that image of them playing the trombones to these pieces. So the next piece I would like to look at by Isabella Leonarda is one of the sonatas that she wrote. This is a violin sonata in D minor, and there's 7 movements in total here. As I mentioned, she didn't stick to the 4-movement format that had become popular. And I'll play a little bit from the Adagio and then some from the Presto. The Adagio, you can hear that it's kind of that unmeasured prelude kind of style or recitative style, which she was probably hearing in operas at the time. So I'll just play a little bit of the Adagio. And now some of the presto. So that's some of the sonata in D minor. And now I'll just go on to the last composer that I'd like to talk about, and that is Elisabeth Jacquet de la Guerre. And she was also born into a family of musicians and harpsichord makers. Her father and her grandfather were harpsichord makers, and they were associated with the court of Louis XIV. They made harpsichords for his court. And she received a technical music education from her father, who was a harpsichord and organ player. And she was considered to be the original child prodigy, like Mozart, but before Mozart. At 12, she was playing harpsichord at the court of Louis XIV and to rave reviews, and she was highly regarded as an excellent harpsichord player. She performed extensively at the court, and then when she was about 20 years old or so, the court moved from Paris to Versailles, and she stayed in Paris, and she got married to a organist, and they created a music business. She wasn't physically at the court, but she continued to receive patronage from Louis XIV, and she dedicated every piece that she wrote to him. So she wasn't entirely independent, but she was living in Paris, and her and her husband performed concerts in Paris. That's how they made their living, and she also taught music there and composed and published these pieces. So she's a good example of how women were starting to become more independent, and you could consider her sort of the first sort of freelance musician composer that we really know about, living in Paris and performing and composing. She didn't publish an awful lot of music, but she did publish in a variety of genres. She published 2 collections of harpsichord pieces and 3 books of cantatas, 8 violin sonatas, 4 trio sonatas, a ballet, and an opera. She was the first major female composer of instrumental music. Of course, she was primarily writing harpsichord music. And she was one of the first native French composers to bring, along with Couperin and Carpentier, to bring the sonata form from Italy to France. And she didn't really want to have all this separation between Italian music and French music, and she started to combine. She used a lot of Italian stylistic things in her compositions, and she used these 2 forms, the cantata form and the sonata form, which came from Italy. She was recognized by her contemporaries as one of the greatest talents of her time, and there's a newspaper quote, "The marvel of our century." Now I'll just play a couple of pieces by Elisabeth. She's best known for her published collections of harpsichord pieces, and a lot of the pieces were suites in the typical French style, where they would have stylized dances grouped into a suite. This one that I've got up here has got 9 movements: prelude, allemande, courante, sarabande, gigue, minuet, chaconne, gavotte, and another minuet. And you can see that the prelude is another one of these unmeasured type of preludes. It was very common at the time. And then there's the rest of the dances. These dance suites were not really used for dancing. They used familiar tempos and dance rhythms, but they were very complicated and highly ornamented, and so they were not used for dancing. I'm going to play a bit of the allemande, and you can hear all of the ornamentation. It's very much in the French style with all of the agréments. And I'll play a bit of the allemande and a bit of the gigue. And some of the gigue. at one more piece by Jacquet de la Guerre, and this is her violin sonata in D minor. And as I mentioned, the sonata at the time was a new genre in France, and she was instrumental in introducing this new genre to France. So this sonata has 8 movements, and I'll play a little bit from the air. Just notice that it's just a beautiful, simple melody with continual accompaniment. And then I'll play a bit of the presto, where you can see that she's using you can see the influence of the Italian instrumental style. You can hear the quick passage work, harmonic sequences, and imitation, which were all things that were quite prevalent in the Italian style of writing at the time. So I'll play a little bit of air. You can hear the French inégale style of playing in this piece. And now a little bit of the presto. That's some of Jacquet de la Guerre's violin sonata in D minor. I really like that last movement because you can tell she's a continual player. She's written a really cool bass line, and as a bassoonist I can surely appreciate that. Okay, so those are the 4 women that I wanted to talk about, and it's probably obvious by now that there was a certain environment necessary for these women to sustain a career in composition. I'll use the word privileged, although considering all of the stuff they had to deal with, They weren't entirely privileged in that regard, but they all had these this socioeconomic environment that made it they were able to compose and perform. They were either born or married into a musical family or family with court or patronage affiliations, and they all received a specialized musical education from either their father or somebody that their father knew. Um, and they all were highly skilled at singing or their instrument before becoming a composer. And part of this is they were very good virtuoso singers, musicians, and they would write material that was very difficult, and so only they could sing it, for example. So that was another outlet for them to perform. They all had performance experience and an audience, which is of course important. So at the court, or traveling around, or in the home, they all had some place to perform. They had financial sponsorship from the various patrons. Um, they had all had some degree of acceptance and encouragement from their peers and from society at the time, and they were all able to get published. They had publishers or copyists. So in many cases, the court controlled the publishing, so they were fortunate to actually get their music published, or it was very expensive, so they would have to have somebody help pay for that. Or in the case of Leonarda, if they worked in an all-female environment such as nunneries or orphanages, they were able to perform and compose in those environments. So in conclusion, these women were fortunate to have these certain essential social and economic conditions to be able to sustain their careers as performers and composers. But given these conditions, they still came up against a set of attitudes that were always prevalent, that threatened to defeat them. Especially in the case of Barbara Strozzi, who was performing, like I mentioned, in the home to these groups of various men. And if you read some of the literature, some of the notes that she's written, she had to put up with an awful lot, let's say. So I'm saying that these were badass women because they had, uncommon talent and determination and courage and will to overcome all of these obstacles. And fortunately, they became published so that we can actually see and hear their music today. And we should strive to play and program this music more often. I'm hoping that Salt Spring Baroque can program some of this music in the future. And here's just a list. I don't expect you to read this, but there's a book by Biber called Sounds and Sweet Airs, The Forgotten Women of Classical Music. I would highly recommend this book, Sounds and Sweet Airs. And this is what got me started thinking about this. This is written in 2016, so it's fairly current. And it talks about 3 out of 4 of these composers, and then goes on to talk about some other women composers in the 19th and 20th centuries. So I'd highly recommend that as a read. It's readily available. And there's some other sources there as well. One that's quite interesting is the Newell's Bates one, an anthology of source readings. It's quite dated, it's 1982, but it's just a collection of original, journal entries and notes and newspaper articles and reviews and things like that were actually written in the time. It's kind of an interesting read. So that's the end of the presentation. If you would like a copy of this presentation or a copy of the actual audio recordings for the full pieces, just send a note to info@saltspringbaroque.com and I can get those to you. And a recording of this Zoom presentation will be available. So you can also send me a note on that if you'd like to see this again or share it with somebody. And eventually we'll be putting it on our website. So thanks everyone for watching, and hope to see you next week when Marco will be talking about rhetoric in 17th century music. That's 10 a.m. Vancouver time on Saturday. Bye for now.